I'm stone deaf in one ear. I just want you to know, I don't know what's being said when I'm sitting back there. But I know if he was introduced to me, it was good stuff. It's the way he's built. So I know it was fine. G.K. Chesterton said, when you see a boy and a girl beginning to date and do all of that, he said, we call it a love story or a love affair. He said, that's not what it is at all. He said, it's a new creation. It's another Adam and Eve with all of the possibilities of God working to fill the world with life. Chesterton had this way of seeing things that we could certainly use. And I couldn't help reflecting as I was watching these people coming up front. You who see this all the time, you can't help it. You become a little accustomed to it, I suppose. Those of us who rarely see it, I suspect, feel it with greater depth. It's absolutely riveting to see this going on. God bless each and every one of you here. Yesterday, just around this time, 46 years ago, Ethel and I got married. I know you'll be pleased with that. So I called her. She said, well, why are you there and I'm here? I said, well, it's the first time they've invited me back in 20 years, and they said they'd help me with a ticket. So that nailed it. There's something else I was supposed to say introductory and I've forgotten. Here's what the text says. I'm supposed to say something uplifting and inspirational, and then we have a session following that brings it down to earth and discusses nuts and bolts. I think both are needed, and you know that's true. One of the movies that they came out with, a Christopher Columbus movie, in one of them, he's asking this guy for money, this big economics minister, and the minister says, you fellas are always dreaming, always looking for money, always dreaming. And Columbus is quite upset with him, drags him to the window, tells him to look out of the window on the city. And he says, what do you see out there? He sees these big buildings, cathedrals, houses everywhere, just libraries and the whole bit. He said, that's what I see. He said, you just see those things because people like me dreamed them. Oh, I think maybe it's that we need constantly brought to our attention. The vision that people can help us then to put into practice. There's this little church in Ephesus. I'm going to take it that it's Ephesus that Paul is writing to, just for the moment. You who know the literature know the difficulties of that. But Paul, by the Holy Spirit, wrote this to the Ephesian believers. And here they are, a little island of decency and integrity and honor in the midst of an ocean of ungodliness. Necromancy, wizardry, idolatry, brawling, this, that, and the other. And they need so much. And Paul's God in Ephesians is so big and generous. Paul doesn't talk about God's grace. He talks about the exceeding riches of his grace. He doesn't talk about his power. He talks about the exceeding greatness of his power. He doesn't talk about his love. He talks about the great love wherewith he loved us, and a love that you can't measure and goes beyond understanding. He doesn't talk about God summing things up. He talks about God summing all things up. He doesn't talk about God summing all things up in heaven. He talks about God summing all things up in heaven and on earth. And all of these marvelous things. And he talks about the life that he gives us. Not just life that comes in apologizing and asking for a little bit of room, but life that barrels in, resurrection life, with no apologies, not begging for room, saying, I'm alive, and I'm alive because I once was dead, and in Jesus Christ have been raised again. All of that God is not only able and willing to do. Imagine that he said, and God can do it. All of that. That's the kind of God that Paul speaks of and believes in. And so when he goes to God fervently in prayer for the Ephesians, what will he ask for? He starts in chapter 1, 14 and following, and he ends up saying, I would love, you know how the text goes, I would love God to open your eyes. I would like you to be able to see who you are. who he is and what he's doing in you. And then he gets caught away, as Paul often does, and he gets back to it in chapter 3:14 and following. He said, I go to my knees and I ask the Father, from whom the very notion of fatherhood and family arrives anywhere. And I beg him that by his Spirit he'll strengthen you in the inner man. And on he goes. You know how that text goes. And he says, I want him to help you understand, to grasp strong Greek words here. Want you to know who he is and who you are and what he's doing in you. It's opening our eyes. It's giving us the capacity to see. I think I need that. Maybe most, I'm not sure about that, but I know we, as the Church of God, that's what we need. Vision of what God's up to. Then I looked, says this text. Then I looked, and there before me was a man with a measuring line in his hand. I asked, where are you going? He answered me, to measure Jerusalem, to find out how wide and how long it is. Then the angel who was speaking to me left, and another angel ran to meet him and said, run, tell that young man, Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of men and livestock in it. And I myself will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord, and I will be its glory within. Zechariah, as you know. This kid went out with a piece of twisted string. That's what they had for a measuring line, as the Hebrew word suggests. He went out with a piece of twisted string in his hand to measure a city that wasn't even there. How can you measure a city that isn't even there? Well, you can if you believe. You can if you believe the promises of God, because faith is the substance of things hoped for. It is the proof of things you can't see. But do you know what's really great about this kid? The year's 520. They got home in 539, probably arrived home at about 537. They started building the temple. And the local gangsters started giving them trouble. Then they sent Cambyses, called Artaxerxes and Ahasuerus in the book of Ezra. He sends a letter, and they stop the building. The enemies are eating on them, hassling them. They become despondent and despaired about it. They start building their own houses without building a church building that visibly reminded them of their true center. And so all kinds of things were going bad. And even when they'd started the temple, it wasn't like Solomon's temple, and the older guys who had seen that were weeping and moaning. And all around this young kid in the vision is gloom, gloom, and more gloom. And this is what's so marvelous about him. The Persian government puts a stop to it. The young kid goes out, quietly picks up a ball of string, and heads out to measure Jerusalem. Don't you love people like that? They see the cancer. They see the raging infections. They see the loved ones going through the ringer. They see day after day hurt. They see children hurting themselves with booze and drugs. And still they trust. These are the kind of people who can teach you the spirit of a multiplying ministry. You have them here in this room. And you can always tell them they're not hard to spot. They run around with a piece of string hanging out of their pocket or their purse. And when they're passing you by, they're always mumbling something about they're going to measure something like that. There they are. And they do that despite long, lingering pain or disappointment. Because they don't believe that God, their God, is the God of things as they are. They believe that their God is the one who sits on the throne and says, behold, I make all things new. This isn't the God of things as they are. I think those things are in the text, but I think we're supposed to see more than that. The faithful young man, the first thing he's told is, put away your string, son. This isn't big enough. To measure that job, you'd have to have a string that would stretch from here to eternity. God is the builder. Whatever God is up to his neck in can't be measured. And it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter what it is. Whether it's a church, a congregation, whether it's a family, or a marriage, or the life of the simplest child, if God's up to his neck in it, you can't measure it. And that's some of our difficulty. We're called by the pain of life, by the disappointments of life, by the long, hard years of work and little fruit shown. There is the temptation to become despondent because our eyes are riveted on things as they are. And this text would suggest to us, yes, the things as they are real, and you ought to take them seriously. And when people tell us, you can't get away from the facts, we say, yes, that's true. But there was a Jewish carpenter, a young man called Jesus. He was always getting away from the facts, wasn't he? Always. And what facts do we want to get away from? Our fickleness or God's faithfulness? Which? Our weakness or God's power? We believe in the facts, but the facts have bigger facts behind them. In the movie The Man of La Mancha, which is never mind what it is. It's The Man of La Mancha. Everybody should be, I was going to give you the background on it, but never mind. Everybody should be forced to watch The Man of La Mancha, if they want to. In the deal, Cervantes and his friend are captured by the Inquisition. They're taken down to a huge cavern, a hole in the ground, and the inmates start giving them a bad time. And one of them in particular hates the group, and he's the cynic of the whole group. And he says to Cervantes, "And what do you do?" He said, "I'm a poet of the theater." And that was Cervantes' mistake. This guy raged against him. He said, "You poets are madmen," he said. "You spin nonsense out of nothing. You take men's eyes off things as they are." Cervantes looked around the hole in the ground with all the drudgery and all the oppression and all of the injustice involved. He said, "Things as they are? You want us to keep our eyes on this? You think it's madness to take eyes off that?" He said, "I've been a soldier. I've been around the world. I've seen people, little scraps of humanity dying in the corner. I've had friends die in my arms. No noble last words, only in their eyes a question. They weren't asking, why am I dying? They were asking, why have I ever lived?" He said, "Who knows what madness is? Maybe you're looking for treasure where there's only trash. Maybe that's madness. Maybe having too much common sense. That's madness. But maddest of all, maddest of all, to see life as it is, and not as it could be. Not as it should be. And you would say, not as it will be. For it's fine now for all of its troubles. Isn't this a lovely ball? Aren't we in the middle of a lovely war? Because we've got the right name. We're doing it for the right reasons, God help us. By faith, we're doing it in the name of the Christ. And to see life as it is, not as it could be, not as it should be, and not as it will be. This would be madness. But we have learned from Him. It's all going to be better, because I myself will be a wall around them, and I will be the glory within. We're not stupid enough to measure the work of God with a piece of string. But we might be tempted to measure it with visible successes and how many baptisms and our lovely programs and our forums and our contributions. But in our heart of hearts, we know better than that. That thing that Bobby Payton and Richard and Klein got up the other evening and told us about how God brought us to here in that marvelous survey of Texas last night. That wasn't measuring. Nobody was intending to measure. I flew over here in the plane, and every now and again at certain points you could see a mountain coming up above the clouds. Anybody who thought that was all there was of the mountains is dreaming. Down below the clouds was the real stuff. What we saw in these surveys were only indicators of what God was doing. The massiveness of it all, the size of it all, the colossal dimensions of it all goes well beyond us. And so we're not measuring anything, not really in the end. It might have taken a long piece of string, but we could have measured Goliath. We could have measured him, 9'9". We had probably seen his big old head, the size of something, and I don't know what. hands the size of tabletops, muscles like water buffaloes. We could have measured him. The Scripture says that he sneered at the shepherd boy who come up to see him. So the Scriptures say. I don't know what he said, but it was something like little shrimp. That's the Hebrew text. He said, little shrimp. Why, I could take his whole head and cover it with one hand. I could measure all of him just by spanning with my finger and thumb. No, he couldn't. Not if he had hands the size of a football field. For there was more wrapped up in that kid with his little piece of string hanging over his shoulder with a bit of leather on it and 5 smooth stones. There was more wrapped up in the courage and faith of that kid than the whole of Philistia could handle. You can't measure what God's involved in. And that's what keeps us alive. And that's what keeps us vibrant. And that's what keeps us going when we look at the years. Some of you have worked for years in these tiny little groups, and we're tempted to measure it in those terms. That doesn't work, does it? Our last line of defense is this, that God is faithful. That's it right there. In Romans chapter 1 through 16 through 17, Paul introduces what he wants to talk about 6 times in those 18 verses. Once every 3rd verse, he uses the word gospel. And then he ends up saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's God's power to save. Some thought he should be. He was a renegade Jew, you see. He dumped the Jews, they said. He dumped the Torah. He got rid of all of that. He ought to be ashamed. Ashamed of nothing. And if the book was written from Corinth, he had written it from an open sewer, where he walked in and it stank to high heaven, and he tore down the curtains and opened the windows and made changes there. So when he writes to Romans, says, I'm not ashamed of God's power because it can save. And it saves everybody. Jew and Gentile, black and white, Irish, English, whoever, saves them all. And why does it save? How does it save? How does it work? And I don't know how it works. I just know what the text says. He said, and there's your God, there's your explanation. In it, God's righteousness is revealed. Takasune theou. It's a genitive. I think we ought to take it for God's own righteousness. It's not a status God gives us. It's His righteousness. And from people like Kramer and H.R. McIntosh and all the way down, we're now learning, thankfully, that it's not only God doing right. It is always God doing right. Righteousness is doing what is right. But righteousness is a relational word. And it's God doing right by His promises. The world had sinned so badly, 1:18 through 3:31 or 32. And then to the Jew, all the way through chapter 3, verse 19, summing it all up. Now we know that whatsoever things the Torah says that those that are under the Torah, but every mouth might be stopped, and the whole world brought under judgment before God. The faithfulness of God is set over against humanity's betrayal and treachery. And that's the good news. And that's what Paul ran halfway across the world to tell the world. You ought to have been abandoned if God hadn't been God. But in spite of all our unfaithfulness, in spite of all of our treachery and all of our betrayal, God is faithful. And that's the bottom line. We gain our victory against sin and death and all of that, not because we are against it, but because He's against it. And in the storm, Jesus comes walking to the man in the boat. Peter wants to know, can I come to you? He says, come, and he does well until he sees the wind. Occasional loss of heart, we understand. When despondency becomes a policy, and we go through life that way, it isn't the harsh realities that sink us. It's the fact that we've taken our eyes off Christ. I don't mean that sounds glib, and I don't mean it to be glib. And I know some of you are hurting terribly, and I don't wish that to be glib. But I know in the end, with my own tiny little life, my troubles get bigger and bigger and deeper when I'm unable to keep my eyes on the Christ. And you know that's so with you. Peter saw the wind, and we see the cancer. Peter saw the wind, we see the financial insecurity. Peter saw the wind, we see our hard work and little fruit. These realities are real as any storm. And Jesus would insist we look at them with steady eyes. He would say they were real, but he would also say, so am I. I'm real also. It isn't for people like us to be conned into measuring God's work with pieces of string or business canons or numerical indexes. We'll give Him our trust and by His grace be faithful stewards. And that's what's before us while we dream the final end. It said of the patriarchs, if they'd wanted to go back, Ted Kell reminded us, you remember? If they wanted to go back to Mesopotamia, they could have gone there. And I suppose it was a temptation at some points. Maybe Abraham all those years running around with a tent in his back and Sarah trotting after him wondering, is this the place? No, this is not it. No, this is not it. Is this it? Yeah, this is it, but we don't get it right now. I suppose it must have been very depressing. And as he loves her deeply and watches her getting older and sickening toward death and then finally dying, I suspect he could have taken her home and buried her at home. Maybe that's where she would have wanted to be buried, but he didn't do that. He kept saying in the middle of all of this, God's got something better. And God looked at him. Hebrews 11 teaches us. God looked at him and thought, that old man really puts me to the test. He trusts me so. I'm not ashamed to be his God, but I would be ashamed if he trusted me so and I let him down. I'll never let him down. And that's one of the things about Jesus Christ. He not only redeemed us, he redeemed God. He made God look good. He did everything right, did it all flawlessly, did it all cheerfully, gave his whole life in every shape and form and fashion to God, and God had him nailed up on a stake outside Jerusalem. And even at that point, especially at that point, the Christ said, you can trust my Father. Christ made him look good. And Abraham made him look good. And you know people that you've lived with, loved with, worked with over the years. People you've known not personally, but known through other people who took God at his word and said, if this is what you're after and you said I'm to go along with it and you'll fulfill your purposes in part through me, I'm your man. I'm your woman. That's who we are. That's who we are. God wasn't ashamed to be called their God, nor was he prepared to let people down. There was a time when the formless void, Genesis chapter 1 and after, there was a time when I'm nearly done. I don't know what time I started, but I know I'm nearly done. There was a time when the formless void said to God, no, no. And God said, yes. And there all this harmony and fruitfulness and life. And then there was an old man, not particularly old chronologically, body was old, and a wife who was barren. And his age and the barren womb said no. And God said, yes. And then later there was this tough man with all the army, strongest man in the world, probably at the time. And a guy out of the desert walked in and said, thus said Yahweh, Israel is my people, let them go. And he said, no. And God said, yes. And he brought them out of there and he got to the Red Sea, and an unruly Red Sea said, no. And God dragged its mouth open and thundered down its throat, yes. And then he turned and looked at the desert, a brooding, threatening, sinister, that swore, no, they'll not go home. And God said, yes. And then the day came when Pilate and the whole crew took a look at him and put him over into the hands of death. And God came one Sunday morning looking for him, and death said, no. And God smashed that rock and said an everlasting yes. This is our story. This is our message. This is what keeps us alive. This is what makes us vibrant in spite of what we see. In spite of the harsh realities, in spite of the pain, in spite of the loneliness, in spite of the abuse, in spite of the oppression, in spite of entrenched evil, in spite of hostile governments, in spite, all of them together saying no, and God saying yes! That's the message we carry. And will it be done? Will we make it? Will it be glorious? It will. This didn't happen. What I'm about to tell you is not true. down Church Street. I'm walking one morning, and there's a fellow on the corner who is building foundations, 150 feet that way, 150 feet that way, 200 feet down into the ground, pouring concrete and those metal strengtheners into it. I said to him, Harry, what are you doing? What are you building? He said, I'm building a doghouse. That's what I did. I said, don't be ridiculous. Come on, what are you building? He said, I'm building a doghouse. I said, you tell it to somebody else. Nobody's going to believe you. Why is that? Too much investment for too little return. You think God has gone to all this trouble? Has put a beloved but rebellious human family through the wringer the way he has done and is doing for some little rinky-dink fulfillment? The poet T.S. Eliot said, I would rather walk every day as I do in terror of eternity than believe at the end of all of this every participant gets an equally worthless prize. The end will justify the means. God is deadly serious about what he's doing. So what he's doing must lead to a glorious end. And our obstacles, the hurts and the pains and the disappointments and the self-disappointments will all work into, when the whole story's told, we'll know. The obstacles didn't close the whole deal. This is the last thing I'm saying, and I'm done. I need to say thank you for letting me be here. Frank Borum was born in Tunbridge Wells, England. He was being carried around by a little girl, a neighbor girl, one day. He was a baby. Met a gypsy lady. This has nothing to do with what I had to say. I'm just going to, that's the thread. But the gypsy lady said you would read the little boy's future. She looked at his hand and said, take him home to his parents. Tell him to put a pen in his hand, and he will never be short of a living. He's going to be a writer. Well, he wrote about 29 books. I've got about 20 of them, but he wrote about 29 books. Wasn't that a lucky guess? Well, that's not what's of interest about him. He went down to the southern end of New Zealand to preach 100 years ago, and he was an outdoors man. I mean, this fellow was an outdoors man. When he went to walk, he went to walk for 10 days. You know that kind of thing? And if he saw ordinary things, he didn't go ooh and ah over it. That's good. But he reserved special words for special occasions. I was in Dallas one time meeting in a very rich home, and a lovely home too. Good people, I mean. The center of attraction was a kid who was about 14, 15 years of age. They had this big celebration meal. It was his birthday. The cook finally brought out a German chocolate cake, big whopping chocolate cake. She gave him the first slice of it. He took a forkful and he went, awesome, he said. Now, this was in the days when verbicide wasn't as bad as it is today. But it was the first time I heard awesome used that way. Awesome? A forkful of German chocolate cake? I said, son, what do you say when you see the Grand Canyon? You know. But it was all good. There was nothing sinister about it. It was a lovely time. We're having a great time. But I'm saying him as the backdrop to Frank Borum. Borum never talked that way. Borum was one of these, he loved life and all of that, but he didn't call a thing awesome if it wasn't awesome. So he and his friends decided to walk north on a road that they always walk south on. Well, they were out for a walk, I don't know, day and a half out, something like that. And they saw some things. It was all interesting, but nothing special. Then at one point, a big fancy car flew by them. Big old fancy car, and big fancy people went past them at about half the speed of light. But not too fast where they could see the people looking with their, nose up. They went up the road, and about 10 minutes later, that same car came by at double the speed of light, and the people in it looking with pity, poor people, and away they went. Well, the boys wondered, how did it come back so soon? Well, about an hour later, they discovered the road ended. Big fence right across the road. It was a dead end, for pity's sake. And I like to imagine the big wheelers going home to the big fancy, and I'm not mad at rich people. Honestly, I'm not. No, I'm not. I mean, it's wonderful. Thank God for all the people that God is blessing with all these riches. Big fancy house, sitting down there to a lovely big meal, fish cakes, 14 forks, 22 knives, and 17 spoons, having a great time and all of that. going into the library, taking their double brandy with a big stogie and talking about, well, what a waste of time it was to head up that road. All that time spent. And some woman would have said it. Had to be a woman. She'd be sympathetic, and she would say, well, bad enough for us. But those poor people, they were walking. She would have said, you see. Well, her sympathy would have been wasted on herself and them. For when Borum and the boys got to the road and saw the fence, that didn't end it at all. They said, let's climb it. So they climbed the fence. They headed up a grassy knoll for about 300 or 400 yards, in under trees. And they come out on the crest of a hill, and Borum said, there before us lay paradise. He said there were miles and miles of green, a riot of color everywhere you looked. The sky just fitted in. Blue was blue, clouds fleecy and lovely, birds going absolutely lunatic with joy and doing their acrobatics. Way down there, a river meandering, had to be made of glass. No, it's not made of glass, because they saw the trees dipping their branches into it, ruffling it enough to let you know it was alive. And then he says, to cap it all off, a kingfisher came, sat on a bush near us with an imperious look. What are you humans doing here in our neck of the woods? With that beautiful blue and the nut brown head and the white throat. And then open the wings, take a look, check him out, you know. Have you ever seen anything like that, he was saying? Borum said it was the loveliest thing I'd ever seen. There's an application to that. I can't remember what it was. We've seen all the fences, not them all. We've seen a lot of them. We've seen a lot of things that have led other people to say, well, too bad we wasted time. He turned out to be a dead end. We know better. Climb the fence. Help me climb the fence. I'll help you. We'll help each other. Let's climb the fence.